Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today our topic is how to clear from heavy metal toxicity. We have a lot of questions from the audience about heavy metal toxicities in humans and even in pets sometimes, although I'm not here to talk about pets right now. But you want to talk to your vet about your pet. If you've got heavy metal toxicity, you may have it in your pet too, because your pets and your children and you probably eat the same thing and probably hang around in the same yard and pick up some of the same toxic heavy metals. One of the biggest sources of heavy metals, just by the way, is things that we track in with our shoes. So it's a nice habit to take off your shoes when you enter a house because you track in heavy metals on your feet. The issue about heavy metals is that once you've decided or tested for heavy metals, you can proceed to do some kind of a cleanse. Now, I'm supposed to tell you should talk with your doctor, although what's the use? Sometimes it doesn't make any sense to talk to your doctor because they're tone deaf. But if they're not tone deaf, if they can truly help you and be wise. Whether you test or don't test, we test in hair, we test in urine, we test in stool, but whether you test or not, you may just decide, I really want to do a heavy metal cleanse anyway, and I don't have any evidence for it. I don't feel so great, and I'm not following the rules of biochemistry, so I'm just going to do a heavy metal cleanse as a therapeutic trial. Lots of people do this, and I've treated low-income patients in the past where they don't have the time or money, mostly money, to test for heavy metals in their hair, and they don't want to go through that process. So they say, well, let me just do what I would do anyway, because these are not toxic cleanses. Most of the cleanses that are done for heavy metals are pretty simple, and they're not highly toxic, so the risk-benefit ratio is quite favorable. Whether or not you've done a test, you may decide to do something to get rid of heavy metals. The heavy metals are elements. They are elements that are formed in stars, and they're whole by themselves. Now, heavy metals are elements, so they're atoms, but they occur in complexes when they're bound to other things in your body. The problem with heavy metals or elements is that you can't completely destroy them because they're an element. So once you get down to an atom of mercury or an atom of lead, you can't detoxify it anymore. You have to carry it out of the body if you want it to stop causing problems. So heavy metals are unlike other toxins in that you must remove the actual atom. You must remove the molecule that contains the atom. So you've got to find a way to get it carried out of your body. But there's really two steps in that process. The first step is you've got to get the metals out of your cells because the metals are stored in compartments. They're stored in fat cells and bone cells and organ cells and muscle cells to different degrees for different metals. And you know, things like lead are stored with calcium in your bones, and other heavy metals may be stored in your brain like aluminum. There's different affinities for different tissues for these different things, and it matters whether they got into your body through a natural means or whether they got in through an artificial means, whether they got in through some kind of lipid particle that was from some kind of adjuvant, or whether it was from some kind of pesticide, or whether you just breathed it in from a volcano that was natural. Now, I'm not saying that natural elements are somehow safer than unnatural elements, only to say that the delivery system can make them a little more nefarious or insidious or penetrative into the brain and into other organs that they might not have made it into. The heavy metals don't always go through phase 1 and phase 2 liver detox pathways. We talked about the liver phase 1 and phase 2 detox. The first one is oxygen, where we try to basically burn the toxin with oxygen, try to denature it and destroy it. And phase 2 is we conjugate it. We try to stick it to something. Now that is much more common in heavy metal processing, but it's not the main way that we get rid of heavy metals. We actually get rid of heavy metals through a process called adsorption, which simply means to stick. All we really do is we get a lot of surface area of something that's the right electrical charge, and if there's enough of this surface area, it sticks to the heavy metal and it carries it out of our body. Now, this process should not be very aggressive, it should be very slow, and it should be very weak, because we don't want to pull out good minerals, we don't want to pull out nutrients, we don't want to pull out healthy stuff, and we don't want to pull them out so fast that we detoxify so rapidly. So what we really want is we want something that will help pull heavy metals out of our cells and get them into the blood circulation, and then we want to get those heavy metals that are in our blood circulation out of our body. We want to get it through the kidneys and out the urine, or we want to get it through the liver into the bile and out of the stool. Now, there's some problems with this because when something goes out of your cells and goes into the liver and goes into the bloodstream and comes out in bile, we have this tendency as humans to be very efficient in recycling our bile. We recycle our bile at least 12 to 14 cycles or times according to physiology textbooks, and I think we do it quite a bit more. So Americans are plagued with toxic bile, especially bile that's laden with heavy metals and fat-soluble poisons that are just bound to bile salts, carried into the small intestine, then reabsorbed in the end of the small intestine to be used again, which is the purpose of bile, is to be used again multiple times to emulsify fat. But if that fat emulsifying bile is full of heavy metals or other toxins, we're just going to retoxify ourselves. So we've got to find a way to get that metal out of the cells and into the blood first, and then out of the blood and bile and into the stool and out of our bodies. And that process is really 2 steps. So the first one, I tend to use alpha lipoic acid. It's a natural supplement. It's a chemical cousin of the B vitamins. It's very similar to B vitamins, although it's not a B vitamin. It allows our bodies to take heavy metals and move them across the membrane to get them out of the cell into the lymphatic fluid, into the extracellular space, and ultimately into the venous blood, and ultimately into the circulation, and then finally into the liver, and out of the liver into the bile, and then into your small intestine. And that's when the second stage begins. The second stage is the stage of adsorption. And adsorption is where that heavy metal or its complex sticks physically to some kind of binder, some kind of physical object. Lots of surface area, lots of particulates. And my favorite one is activated charcoal. We tend to use activated charcoal. It's very safe. It's kind of the universal detoxicant, and it comes in a couple of forms. Activated charcoal comes as bamboo, and it comes as coconut. It's basically wood fibers that have been charred or burned a little bit, and they're ground up and cleanly put into capsules, and you can take those by mouth, and they come out of your body, and hopefully they carry the bile that's toxic out of your body in your stool. And so that means that your stool will be a little bit black, and you'll have some black stool in the toilet, and you have to be careful that you understand that that's not bleeding in the digestive tract. If you just took activated charcoal, it's just the activated charcoal, because some people that don't take activated charcoal have bleeding in their stools. They have blood that came from a bleed way up high in the digestive tract, maybe in their stomach, or from an ulcer, or from something wrong with their small intestine, and that will come out as black tarry stools. It doesn't look the exact same thing as bamboo or coconut activated charcoal, but it can be similar because it's black and it discolors the stool. So be careful to look for that. If you want to tell the difference, you just get an occult blood test in stool. You have an analysis of blood and stool, and there will be a chemical reaction that will show you and your doctor that there's actually blood in your stool, and there shouldn't be. So just remember that we've got to get rid of this stuff. We normally sweat these things out a little bit. We sweat out mercury and aluminum a little bit. We grow out in our hair and our nails and our skin a little bit. We store a lot of these things in our bones, so we have to have good bone turnover. So sometimes people have been elderly and not had very good bone health, don't often turn over their bone cells fast enough to get rid of heavy metals. And when they start to work on osteoporosis, if they're elderly and they've got problems with osteoporosis, they may find that they start detoxifying heavy metals out of their bone. When they're finally successful at turning over old bone into new bone, they start to get symptoms of toxins, and they may suddenly see new heavy metals show up in their hair and in their stool and in their urine because they had all this heavy metal stored in their osteoporotic bone, and as that bone was whittling away, it was becoming more highly concentrated in heavy metals. And so when they start to tear down and rebuild bone and get it stronger again, they tear down old toxic bone that was full of these heavy metals and release it into the blood supply in the hair. So realize that sometimes these things can happen and they're confusing, but they're not necessarily bad news. They're just physiology cleaning house. To get these toxins out of our body, it's not just activated charcoal. For all detoxification, we need protein in our diet, we need magnesium and healthy minerals in our diet, and as I mentioned, alpha lipoic acid. The alpha lipoic acid serving size can start very small. Some people need very few milligrams per day, or they get very sensitive and they have some problems with their skin, they get eczema, they get digestive problems, they get headaches, they get detox reactions from detoxing heavy metals. And we don't want to do that, especially in our non-talkative autism spectrum patients, the ones that aren't talking. We don't want to release heavy metals so rapidly that they become released from organs and redeposited into brain and spinal cord and nerve tissue. So it's important to get our alpha lipoic acid serving size right and start slow and gentle and increase as time goes by. The typical amount is, in the literature, is around 600 milligrams a day for adults in order to help rehabilitate nerves. There is no real dose or serving size talked about for heavy metal toxicity, but I like to target between 100 and 600 milligrams a day for an adult, usually in the morning, and I like to give my activated charcoal at night after all food, because I don't want that activated charcoal to bind to any of the food or supplements they may take. Because if you take a supplement of any kind, its likelihood of sticking to the charcoal and being carried out of your body is very high. So you don't want to waste your money by taking a supplement and just pooping it out. I think some of you are having a drinking game based on how many times I say poop. Another binder that's very useful is glucosamine sulfate. Glucosamine sulfate is a supplement that I actually buy mine at Costco and other places. gases. There's another set called humic and fulvic acids, which are essentially acids that occur in soil. There are some people around the world and children around the world that eat soil for a couple of different reasons. One is because of mineral deficiency called pica, and they eat the soil because they need minerals, and they often get heavy metals when they do that in the United States or places where soil is toxic, especially in children, is because humic and fulvic acids are in healthy soil. Healthy, lofty soil that you pick up and can crumble and is not made into cement or hardened clay or dusty, useless soil that can't grow anything. Those healthy soils have humic and fulvic acids which can bind to heavy metals and carry them out. So there are supplement companies that do a good job of making humic and fulvic acid pills, capsules, and powders that you can take orally quite safely to remove heavy metals. There are also bile salts and ox bile, which help us replace our bile, because one of the things that are going to happen when you do this is you're going to lose your bile, and you're going to have insufficient bile because you're actually trying to get rid of your bile and not recycle it because it's full of heavy metals. So as you get rid of this, you're going to see green stools, you're going to see maybe green color in your ionic foot baths, you're going to see green in your stool that sometimes floats and sometimes sinks. You might see little beads of fatty, greasy stools. You might see sometimes oil in the surface of the toilet water because of the problems of not having enough bile. So you might need bile salts or ox bile or taurine or things like that. Many people use fibers. Now, I'm not a big fan of vegetable fibers and plant fibers for this purpose. However, some people like to use ground up flax seeds, and some people use soaked flax seeds. I don't think that's terrible, but I'm not a big fan of lectins, and so I don't use a lot of plant fibers. But some people do. And then there's the clays. There are several kinds of clays, kaolinite and montmorillonite and other types of clays that different people use. And the problem with clay is that clay, when it binds to heavy metals, you need a fair amount of it. And many types of the clays are in a liquid form, and there's very little clay because you can see through it, and there's very little clay in the water, which is not terrible. It just doesn't remove the metals very fast. And I said earlier, if you're listening, that you don't want to remove metals very fast. So it's okay to use a liquid-based clay. It's going to take a long time, possibly longer than using charcoal. But if you do use clay, some people use powdered clays. And the problem with powdered clays is when they go into your body, if they run into a bad condition, the clay chemically will be denatured and it will be made into cement. And when it's made into cement, it will stick inside your intestine. And you can actually take an X-ray picture of that in your large intestine, and you may need colon hydrotherapy. In fact, Hippocrates wrote about this in his books 450 years before Christ, about how hydrotherapy is required to get the clay out after you use clay to help detoxify people when they take it orally. So just realize that colon hydrotherapy may be necessary if you choose clay, and you may get really, really constipated and really heavy in your large intestine if you do use oral clay as a cleanse. So I don't tend to use it very much. There are some problems in bile production in that when you eat a diet full of lectins, the lectins may cause your liver and pancreas to not make the right amount of lectins, because lectins are inhibitory to the digestive system, and they can reduce the efficiency of the digestive juices and the digestive motion. And there are some discussions of this on different websites and YouTube channels. I won't go into that today, but lectins can inhibit digestion and bile production. The job of lectins is to tell animals to move along and leave me alone if you're a plant. You make lectins and you distribute them in your plant tissues so that the animals that eat those plant materials will move along. And so that's part of how lectins actually work. We need to help the kidneys too in this process. I like to use herbal teas like full leaf chamomile tea. I like to use cracked cell chlorella, parsley, and cilantro juice. And these things also help the liver, but they help the kidneys quite a bit. You can use sauna or infrared sauna for sweating, because sweating helps, especially with mercury and aluminum. And we have to talk about aluminum for a minute, because getting rid of heavy metals is a real problem. One of the big sources of heavy metals is people that are taking heavy metal containing adjuvants that are in shots and jabs. Aluminum is high in aluminum containing antacids. The highest amount of oral aluminum that goes into humans is from antacids. And then there's the injectable kind. Realize that if you're trying to clear aluminum from your gut that you've eaten, you can just take silica and silica-containing herbs, and it will usually bind to the aluminum in your gut and go out in your stool. But if you're trying to get rid of aluminum that's in your brain, you've got to find a molecule that can cross the blood-brain barrier, grab the aluminum, and carry it across the blood-brain barrier and carry it out of your kidneys through the urine. And there's not many things that will do that, but Christopher Exley has talked about this, and so has Dennis Krauss, which is silicic acid water, which is water that's got silicic acids dissolved into it, and that's very important. And that's things like Fiji and Gerolsteiner, or you can make your own, according to Dennis Krause's book, Silica Waters. It's about a liter a day of 30 parts per million silicic acid for 3 to 6 months, and it can really pull that aluminum out of the brain. So that is your heavy metal toxicity, how to get clear yourself from it. Thank you.